So about 8 years ago, I was at a conference on emergency medicine when a speaker was introduced as an expert in disaster response. And as he approached the podium, he said, "Thank you very much for the kind introduction, but I'll have to politely decline the title. The truth is, there's no such thing as an expert in disaster response. We've never gotten it right." He then went on to say that not only are there no experts in disaster response, but there's no such thing as a natural disaster either. That in fact, all disasters are man-made. And this really resonated with me. Just a little over a year earlier, I had been sent to Haiti after the 2010 earthquake as part of a disaster response team, and that earthquake had devastated the capital city of Port-au-Prince. And I'd been to disasters before, but I had never seen anything like this in my life. It looked like a total war zone. But the reality was it wasn't a war zone, it was just an earthquake. And in fact, on paper, it was nearly identical to the 1989 San Francisco Bay Area earthquake. Matching them up side by side, you see that they were both what's called a transform fault, where two tectonic plates rub against each other. They both reached a 7.0 magnitude on the Richter scale. And they also both reached a level 9 on the intensity scale, which is classified as violent shaking. But despite their near identical composition, the outcomes were completely different. In the San Francisco Bay Area earthquake, 63 people died, and there were just under 4,000 who were injured. While in Haiti, estimates reached upwards of 350,000 fatalities, with many more injured and millions displaced. So how does this happen? How do you have two identical earthquakes with such completely different outcomes? The answer is quite simple. It's infrastructure. Man-made structures were responsible for the outcomes in both situations.
It's not going to create noise.
In California, for the past 100 years, they have been writing, improving, and enforcing legislation that is solely focused on preventing deaths during earthquakes. While in Haiti, no such legislation exists. In fact, there are no uniform building codes. There are no quality material standards. The other thing is that while both cities are built on rolling hills, they're set up a little different. San Francisco, you have a very nice grid, very similar to Manhattan, with row houses stacked neatly next to each other. But in Haiti, these rolling hills are covered in essentially cement shantytowns, where you have concrete houses built one cinder block at a time with substandard materials assembled by amateur architects and designed to keep out the sun, the heat, the rain, and the mud, with virtually no attention paid whatsoever to earthquakes. So when the earthquake comes, all of the flaws and the imperfections are exposed, and the whole place collapses in on itself, decimating the population of Port-au-Prince. Despite all of the death and destruction, I also saw scores of the most inspiring stories while in Haiti, of humans helping humans. This was particularly true when it came to emergency care and transport. Despite the fact that Haiti has no formal 911 system as we recognize it in the United States, there are no ambulances filled with resources, staffed by trained paramedics and EMTs. Despite the fact that they don't have this formal 911 system, when you go to the hospitals, they're absolutely packed with patients. And standing next to the patient is usually a family member or a friend who's holding in their hand a telephone, a mobile phone. And this phone is used in one way or another to coordinate transport to the hospital. So this kind of help with the mobile phones extended far beyond just emergency care and transport. It seemed like the entire disaster relief operations were being organized and executed at the grassroots level, as if everybody were taking matters into their own hands, bypassing the traditional aid agencies and relief organizations to take care of survival and recovery on their own. There were spontaneous groups of digital volunteers that were working together to intercept text messages from people who were stuck under the rubble. And they'd take those text messages, figure out the location, and they'd send it to responders on the ground who could go then and dig those people out of the rubble. NGOs were using text messages to bypass the middlemen of aid disbursement and getting aid directly to earthquake victims via transfers, money transfers, using text messages. completely revolutionizing how aid is dispersed in a post-disaster setting. And then there are also groups that were using their phones to compile maps like we had never seen before, showing the movement, near real-time movement of the displaced populations as they looked for new places to set up what essentially became tent cities. So all of this for me was just really inspiring to see, and it was also very eye-opening. You see, at that time, I was at a bit of a crossroads myself. I had spent the past 5 years working on a very busy ambulance in San Diego, and I was looking for a new direction to head in, something new to do. I was also volunteering as a paramedic with the Red Cross in Tijuana, Mexico, and I had a part-time side job as a flight medic, which sent me and a nurse to different Latin American countries to pick up injured and sick Canadians and Americans and bring them back to North American hospitals. Through these experiences, I began to learn a lot about how you develop an emergency medical system when you don't really have any of the resources you need. And this question, how do you develop an emergency response system without resources you need, intrigued me so much that I eventually founded a nonprofit organization called Trek Medics International. Trek Medics International is focused on improving access to emergency care and transport in resource-limited settings. Before the earthquake, we were involved in some pretty standard nonprofit initiatives. We would donate EKG monitors or defibrillators or cervical collars when we could get them to ambulance services and fire departments in Mexico and other Latin American countries. And when me and my fellow paramedics could get time off from work and we had money, we would sometimes travel to different countries to give training courses to EMTs and paramedics. But after the earthquake, this stuff all started to look a lot short-term, Band-Aid solutions, important stuff, but none of it was going to overcome the infrastructural challenges that these countries and communities faced in ensuring access to emergency care and transport. You see, the realization I had in Haiti was that if you were to have removed all of the rubble and the earthquake never happened, and you were to have filled Port-au-Prince with all of the ambulances and resources and supplies and paramedics and EMTs that they could have asked for, it really wouldn't have made all that much of a difference. Because again, the problem is infrastructural. It's not resources. It's how do you coordinate this system? And as it turned out, the mobile phones that they were using seemed to be a good place to start. And this whole point about how ambulances themselves wouldn't solve the problems was driven home nearly a year later when the government of Brazil donated 30 ambulances to Port-au-Prince. Most Haitians knew intuitively when those ambulances arrived that they would never get in the back of that ambulance. The reason why is because Port-au-Prince is a city built of 4 million people where 70% of the urban population live in communities that are inaccessible by road. No matter how hard you try, you're not getting an ambulance up the side of that hill. So after the earthquake, I went back to San Diego, started thinking about a lot of this stuff and the infrastructural issues, and it became apparent that if we could come up with a way to overcome these challenges, we would have a lot to offer. Not only would we have a lot to offer, but there would be a lot of people that would be interested in working with us. Because the reality is that these informal response networks that are used to transport the sick and injured from the top of that hill to the bottom, this isn't unique to Haiti, nor is it unique to a post-disaster setting. I would venture to say that outside of the 25 richest nations, there are few countries on this planet where somebody can take a phone, call a simple number like 911, and be guaranteed that in less than 10 minutes, an ambulance is going to be at their side, whether they're rich or poor. I would even go further to say that for 80% of the world's population, it's these informal response networks that are what they rely on. And these informal response networks are comprised of untrained bystanders, family members, friends, good Samaritans, who abide by the principle of the path of least resistance and are in a default response mode of panic to get people to the hospital any way they can. Grab them by the ankles, grab them by the wrists, put them in the back of the truck, put them on a motorcycle, let's get to the hospital and go. So once I got back to San Diego, it became apparent that if we could find a way to tap into this action potential, if we could find a way to harness these informal emergency response networks, find a way to formalize them, coordinate them, organize them, then we would really be onto something. So about 5 months after the earthquake, I resigned my job on the ambulance, and I moved back here to New York City, and I enrolled in Columbia University's Executive Masters in Public Health program. And one day I was in class, and a student came up to me and said, "I thought you might find this article interesting." And I took a look at it, and this is 2010, mind you. But I read this story about how a healthcare group was using text messages to send out to their group health workers and also to patients. And they would text each other back and forth with updates on their health status and if they needed to see a doctor or go to a clinic. And as soon as I read this, a million light bulbs went off in my head. That night I went home and I started drawing the designs for a software platform. A software platform that would essentially take the workflow that was used in our mini computers. Every ambulance out there in the United States, more or less, has these mini computers that are used to alert, dispatch, coordinate, and track emergency response units. And I figured that if I could come up with a way to put that workflow onto a feature mobile phone and transmit that information back and forth between responders and victims using SMS text messages, we would really have something powerful. That night I wrote the entire diagrams, I looked at it, and I was like, problem solved. 911 where there is none, right? Emergency care anywhere. This is so easy. Except it wasn't. It was actually quite difficult. And I spent the next 2 years basically figuring out that nobody was going to fund the software. So eventually I saved up my own money. I went out and I found a company, a software company, who agreed to write the source code for us at a real cut rate. And today that software platform is called Beacon. Beacon is a text message-based, do-it-yourself emergency dispatch platform that allows any agency or group to design, test, launch, and be ready to scale their own emergency 911 system anywhere there's a mobile phone signal on their own in under 30 minutes or less, requiring only one internet-connected device. Today, we have responders, paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, search and rescue groups, even animal rescue groups are using Beacon to coordinate, dispatch, and track their responders in 7 countries, including here in the United States. Well, hold on a second. United States, I thought we had a 911 system here. What's this all about? Well, it's true, we do have a 911 system, mostly, but not always and not everywhere. What many people here probably don't realize is that your 911 system, your local 911 system, can be overwhelmed very easily. And that resource-limited settings doesn't necessarily apply to developing countries. It applies to the environment that you're in. I'll give you 3 examples in the past few years from here in the United States where we've seen resource-limited settings. First one, Superstorm Sandy, 2012. When Superstorm Sandy came through, there were 37 health facilities in New York City that needed to evacuate 6,300 patients out of their hospitals because they were at risk of being flooded or losing power. Such an evacuation doesn't happen easily. And so these hospitals essentially had to call in every ambulance available in the entire tri-state area to make sure that they could get their patients out of the hospital, leaving huge coverage gaps where these ambulances used to serve. They eventually had to backfill these ambulances with other ambulances from around the country. 2017 in Houston, Hurricane Harvey. In many communities, the flooding was so deep that the available resources, those that weren't flooded or damaged by the hurricane, they couldn't even get to them. And in fact, the Houston Fire Department had one high water rescue vehicle at the time that Hurricane Harvey hit, and it wasn't even working. Just last year, Paradise, California, the Camp Fire. When the Camp Fire came through Paradise, there were 2 911 dispatchers on call at the local 911 call center when thousands of calls started coming in. In all 3 cases, the same thing happened. The local emergency system was quickly and unexpectedly overwhelmed. Mobilizing resources from outside of the communities to bring them in took too long, so the responsibility for critical, life-saving emergency response operations fell to the local communities. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers helping strangers, exactly what we had seen in Haiti after the earthquake and what we see in developing countries every day. When we started developing Beacon, and ever since, we've always wanted to show it to other responders, other agencies, governments, community leaders, people who are in a position to organize these kind of systems. Rich or poor, it doesn't matter. We just want to know, what do you think? Would this work for you? How could it be improved? And at the beginning, we used to hear the same thing from responders in the richer nations, in advanced systems. And they would say, basically, that's a great idea. It makes a lot of sense. I could totally see how this would help a primitive emergency response system like you guys are working with in developing countries. But our systems are far more advanced and sophisticated. We need something different. Well, over the past few years, we've been hearing that a lot less and less. And we've been hearing the opposite more and more. People saying, we could really use this. This could help us really expand our coverage. And I think the reason that we're hearing this less and less, that they couldn't use it, is because there's a growing recognition among first responders and emergency managers that maybe we're not the experts in disaster response we thought we were. We can take care of the day-to-day emergencies, but when the big one comes, the playbook usually gets thrown out the window. You see, year after year, the storm surges are rising more and more, the levees are continuing to break, and with far more devastation. And when they do, we're beginning to see that it's becoming more and more common for the locals to bust out the canoes and the kayaks and the fishing boats to go fill gaps in the formal response system when the disaster comes through. And as we become more and more accustomed to seeing these informal responders joining the formal response system, it becomes a lot harder to see a difference between the advanced emergency systems in the richer nations and the primitive emergency systems in the poorer nations. Thank you very much.